Okay, well, welcome to Philosophy of Corrections, a graduate program that is here at UNC Pembroke in the MPA. And I have the privilege tonight to introduce truly three of the experts in our field, especially what we're studying now. Dr. Paul Gendreau, who's one of the most famous criminologists, or excuse me, criminal researchers in the world and has been for so many years. We met him in, Mario met him in the 80s, and I got the privilege of meeting him and his wife, Yvette, who's one of my absolute best friends and the smartest woman I've ever known, which I tell everybody, who is a psychologist. I think you have a psychologist PS, Yvette?
MAPS, yeah.
MAPS, okay. And what does that mean?
In two different provinces. In
two different provinces. And then Dr. Mary Paparozzi, who you know is the chair of our department here at UNC Pembroke from 2000. How long were you the chair, Mario?
I don't know. I was there from 2003 to 2023, and I was the chair for 16 years. So, but I don't remember.
And he's now Professor Emeritus, and he is a sociologist who has his background in criminology. And welcome to UNC Pembroke, guys, Dr. Gendreau and Yvette and Mario. Welcome to my class. So we're going to be talking about some of Dr. Gendreau's articles that we're covering in the Ed Latessa book this semester, which is called Correctional Context, Contemporary and Classical Readings. We've had quite a journey this semester in all different types of correctional treatment over the years. And if anybody was part of what works, it's Dr. Paul Gendreau. Welcome to the class, Dr. Gendreau. Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
There you
Wake
go.
up. And Yvette Theriault, as I mentioned, she's a psychologist. She works with Paul on many of his articles. She's had her own incredible career in psychology, and she is an expert on the instruments and stuff we've been talking about. And Dr. Mario, of course, it was the New Jersey Parole Board Chairman, Assistant Commissioner of Corrections. So he brought to UNC Pembroke both his academic background, as I mentioned, his doctorate in sociology with the concentration in criminology, but he also brought in how many years in the field, Mario?
Taught or worked?
Work, the field of criminal justice.
Oh, teaching is working. Don't let me. But I worked as a practitioner. I worked as a practitioner from 1973 to 2003. So how many years is that? You went to Catholic school. You're good in math. I went to Linden High, not too.
So I've asked Dr. Gendreau to talk about your questions about correctional quackery, the 3 C's that he mentions, that is mentioned in the article that he's written. I've also asked him to talk about this common sense approach. He sent you 3 wonderful articles. I hope you had a chance to review them. And so we're going to put it up now to Dr. Gendreau. Dr. Gendreau, you can either ask questions or you can summarize what the philosophy of corrections should be today.
All right. Well, I have a number of questions in regard that they run off of the article, Chaos Theory in Correctional Treatment and the like. So I'd like to begin, first of all, providing a baseline from which I operate. I'm a psychologist. I started working in corrections in 1962, 61, and both in applied fields, primarily within Canada, but also have been to the United States frequently. And I've also worked on correctional issues in some other countries, New Zealand, Australia, and Jamaica being 3 of them. I've been a researcher most of my life. I've also done a lot of clinical work when I worked in the field. So that's my general background. And so I'm going to start off with a way of talking about the issues that isn't particularly glamorous. And you're going to have just to bear with me. So I'd like an overhead, if I could, Yvette, of knowledge destruction and common sense, and that particular overhead that you have. If we could show that on the screen.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, you can see it.
Now I'm going to go over this fairly quickly, but throughout my career, I have operated out of generating knowledge that will make the correctional settings, and that includes in the community, probation, parole, to be a more humane enterprise and one that tries to follow the evidence. And so in this overhead, which is a bit dense, and I won't get into the various details, my major concern is if we can just move it down a bit, if we could, Yvette. Yeah, go up a bit more. About, yes, knowledge, destruction, common sense. And we have to be aware of the battleground, as it were, in terms of deciding what we do. From an administrative position to a clinical position, and any other way that you intersect with the criminal justice system. And so there's two ways of generating knowledge that is going to make corrections a more humane process and a more effective one in terms of trying to reduce criminal behavior. And one source of knowledge is what I call based on common sense and knowledge destruction. And that is one of the things we see in the criminal justice system is a lot of evidence that is strictly qualitative, based on I said so, testimonials, prejudices, anecdotes, and that sort of thing, morally superior visions. But if you use that kind of process, research has shown that if you try to develop programs based on a qualitative source, based on authority in these testimonials, you're going to have very little effect. And if anything, make things worse. The other way is you use evidence that is based on, it says, careful observation of phenomena. I'm going to continue on what I mean by knowledge construction. It's that you use evidence that's based on data, first of all, from case histories, surveys, and then based on actual research studies that have some kind of comparison groups. For example, a treatment is given to one group and not another one. Standard experimental design. This means that one has to have had or should access courses that talk about research design. And the fact is that we've always tried to, at least in my career, and some other like-minded people like-minded people, is to take evidence from what they call our quasi-experimental designs, studies that have various sort of control groups. And then the kicker is with summarizing all of this knowledge based on a large body of quantitative studies, and that's called meta-analysis. So what I have to say to you in terms of what works with the group that I work with and some others is that we try to generate policies based on meta-analysis rather than on the other side of the fence, knowledge is based on, this is sort of social psychological stuff based on, this qualitative anecdotal kind of stuff, which can really cause all kinds of problems. Now, if we go down to integrating evidence, just we could scroll down. The integration of evidence from a qualitative format is, I'm telling you like it is, what everybody knows. We explain things by just naming things. Exceptions prove the rule. And the evidence is idiographic, that is focused on single cases. Whereas on the other side, the integration of evidence says, look, there's a large body of data, causality is complex, but you describe your results in probabilistic terms. That is based on our meta-analytic stuff, which is based on individual studies. We find out, for example, that people taking this program will have a 10 or 15% reduction in recidivism. So it's very quantitative. And secondly, there are a number of studies that have been replicating these sorts of results. The Another aspect that bedevils a field, and it's in correctional quackery, is that we see subscript A at the bottom. People arguing that there are many sciences, my version of the science, and the facts are inviolable. And this kind of reasoning comes from the extreme left and the extreme right. And so when people use these arguments, they are using it to promote an ideology that has very little substance. But since they believe it is true, their common sense, it must be true. And that, in fact, is not the case. And in one of the readings that have been sent to you, it's interesting where common sense comes from. Because we hear this all the time, don't we, in the public? It is common sense. We have our politicians, for example, in this country and likely in yours and other countries saying, we are going to give you common sense solutions. These common sense solutions are all based on this qualitative approach. And it is very egocentric because it argues that it is my vision must be true. And this was born by a famous Scottish philosopher, Thomas Reid, years ago, saying that an individual's common sense was always accurate. And so that is the basic philosophical underpinning of how we've come to common sense. It's an arrogant kind of position where someone says, I have the answers based on my personal experience. Well, one's personal experience may be useful, but we're interested in generating evidence that is more than just the individual case, which is really open to biases. Now, another thing about common sense, there is both good and bad common sense. The bad common sense is when you just use your own personal experience and as a general law of how things should work. Now, common sense does work in a sense. Sorry for that. But in regard to, well, it makes, no, don't put your hand on a burning element. Common sense would tell you to do that. Common sense, would say, make sure you lock your car after and you leave it, or don't leave the windows open in the house when it is 10 below zero or something like that. But even then, common sense, which we think we all have, can be wrong. Or how often do we fail to do these things, which is a violation of basic common sense, and you get into problems. So at one level, common sense for very simple things can be accurate. But it falls apart when you're dealing with complex science issues, which is just not in our area. It is in medicine, it is in physics, and any other field. So that's just sort of a general background of where I come from in trying to argue about what works and what doesn't, which will then generate policies that will be for the common good, particularly in our own area. So I'll just put that aside and I won't come back to it, and we can talk about some other things. In regard to the first question, chaos theory and correctional treatment, and maybe you've had a chance to read that article. And there is a question about unique needs. I think it's always important when you're dealing with people who are in trouble with the law to be concerned about individual differences and what they bring to the table. But if we're going to generate effective programs, there are some laws or some ways of doing our business that cover the great majority of offenders. I'll move on to question number 2 as to what are
I'll read
these...
the question. Yeah,
Yeah.
please read the whole question. Thank you.
Oh, I'll read them out? Oh.
Yeah, so because if the students don't have it in front of them.
Okay. What do you see as the most significant challenges in implementing evidence-based practices in correctional facilities and how can these challenges be addressed? Well, first of all, as a general perspective, you have to be aware of correctional quackery and the law of fart catchers, which is a legitimate American word, by the way, and that is in your readings. Now, what are the challenges? Oh my goodness. Some of these challenges are systemic, and it's in regard to how we do business in general. As an individual working in the business with all good intentions, you'll come across a lot of barriers. And these barriers are in regard to how corrections operates. At the very top level, well, you need an organization that is committed from the top on down to the workers, that follows a philosophy, that follows and develops programs that are based on the evidence that comes from a quantitative sort of approach. And we have all examples, certainly in my country, and no doubt in your country in some places. And this is something that Mario can speak to, because we both had articles in a journal not that long ago about this. And that is, our business is politicized tremendously. Rarely do you find people at the very senior level that have had even a rudimentary education in the field that they are administering, because of the nature of political appointments. What we do in our business is a science story. What they do at the political level is not a science story. It could be by chance, but it generally isn't. It is about pure political issues, which are necessary if you want to maintain your political structure. And let me show you how sometimes I want to give a positive example rather than a harangue on the political structure. We were able, in our jurisdiction, the province of Ontario, to develop all kinds of effective programs. The whole basis of knowledge of risk-need responsivity and that approach, which has substantial empirical support, has came about due to the fact that we had, as a minister of corrections, who turned out to be a Hall of Fame hockey player, but his values were to, and he came from a juvenile background, to help people. And then he had, as deputy ministers, it reported to him, people who were also had a philosophy of trying to do good in a progressive way and not in a punitive way. And then that came down to the regional level, where we were fortunate to have a regional director who also shared the same philosophy and was a strong supporter of having research being done in his organizations in the Ontario region that would develop an effective programs. And then who were running the programs in the institutions were people who all had the required training in psychology, in behavioral approaches, in how to develop risk assessments, and so on and so forth. And so that is how you can have a system that can be progressive. In this system, by the way, we had extensive links with the universities, where we had student interns at the undergraduate and graduate level coming into work to learn how to do effective treatment and other sorts of things that psychologists and people in social work should do. And so you have that kind of system that that was conducive to doing the right sort of thing. And all around us, of course, where we didn't have this kind of relationships with the universities, with students, with a regional director who was a strong supporter of what we were doing. When that didn't exist in other regions, they were not doing anything particularly effective at the least. I've spoken long enough. There's other things here, but I'd like other people to, Mario or Yvette, like to try to deal with some of the questions or issues, and I can come back a bit later.
Mario, would you comment on what happened with you in New Jersey?
Sure. By the way, I worked, as I said, for 30 years in a Department of Corrections and then the State Parole Board, which became the Department of Corrections. And I didn't realize that when I was a young student who I graduated in 72. I got this job in 73. I didn't realize what I was watching. Paul came up with a term a few years ago, I don't know, several years ago, called chaos theory. And my life was chaotic where I was working. I didn't know that it wasn't supposed to be chaotic. Because the head of the Department of Corrections in any state, including North Carolina, is, as Paul mentioned before, politically appointed. You don't get the job unless you know somebody or unless you're involved politically. You don't get to be the chairman of a parole board or on the parole board unless you know people politically. Frankly, you don't get to be a judge. In North Carolina, we elect them. I wonder how many people really know who they're voting for. In New Jersey, where we lived many years, they're appointed. The parties take turns. When there's a vacancy, a Republican was the last one. This time it'll be a Democrat. Next time it'll be a Republican. And they get to be judges. Now, these jobs pay a lot of money. I mean, they pay a boatload of money. And if you advertised, I used to say, if you advertised for those jobs, a lot of people would apply who have the proper values, the proper skills, the proper educational degrees, and so on. But we don't do that. I became a parole board chair. And so I guess the best example is me. I became the parole board chair because I happened in my life to run for county commissioner, and I won. And because of that, I got to meet some politicians. I didn't do it for any other reason. I did it for 3 years. I would never do it again. The political system, in my opinion, is very corrupt. So I did it one time, but I met politicians. When they really were in a jam and they needed somebody to run the parole board, they asked me. Why did they ask me? Not because I had a PhD in the proper field, not because I spent my life growing up in the system that I was really passionate about my job, not because I cared immensely about bringing the field forward in a professional way. They asked me because they knew me, and they wouldn't have known me if I wasn't a politician for those 3 years. And so I got hired by a governor who said they wanted to professionalize an agency. And I said, that would be great. I'll do it if you want to professionalize the agency. In fact, I called Paul and I said, what am I going to do? I don't want to take this job. I want to get out of here and so on. And he said, well, you'll be a hypocrite because you've told everybody all these years you have to take politics out of it and put professionalism in it. So I blame Paul for staying. But anyway, I stayed. And in 6 months, the governor who hired me went to Washington, D.C. to work for President Bush as the director of the Environmental Protection Agency. And then I went through 3 more governors in short order who no longer had an agenda to professionalize the agency. And so I stayed for 2 years and then I left. I could have stayed a lot longer, but I wasn't about that. And I was ready to retire and go into academia and so on. So look, my entire life I've watched this. And I frankly have been all over this country, only 4 states I haven't been in, and it's no different. It's not different in New Jersey, North Carolina, New Mexico, Hawaii. All of the politics of the moment has total influence over what the policies are. And even if you were a chief of police in a town in the US, which I know many people, you probably know people who work in police departments and sheriff's departments, they're all political. You get a new mayor, the chief of police works for the mayor, and the mayor wants to do business this way. The next mayor may want to do business another way. And it's not uncommon for an election to occur, and all the senior people get pushed out, and a new crew comes in. And by the way, we who worked in the field, as I did for many years at lower levels, we used to call ourselves weebies. And I thought that was a great phrase the first time I heard it. I remember who told me, Judy. Lou Mancuso told me that. He goes, "Don't worry, Mario. We're weebies. We be here when they came, and we be here when they gone." Right? So, and that's what I tell people. Take the longer view. Don't lose sight of where we need to go, which is what Paul Gendreau has been about. And when I met him in the 80s, it turned me on immensely. And his friends and colleagues who wrote about these things, you never lose sight of where you need to go, as tough as it is. You can't be a bull in a china shop, because you'll get fired or they'll crush you in the agencies. But you never lose sight of where you need to be going in this business. And it's I say business, it's a profession, but we don't treat it like a profession. Professions run on research evidence, on good theories. They don't run on politics. And so, and professions build on knowledge. This year we know this much. Next year we know more. We'll build on that, etc. My field, it's like your favorite flavor of the week, or who's in charge this time, and this is what we're going to do. There's a movement sweeping America. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but there's a movement sweeping America the last 10 years, I guess, called Swift and Certain. What's the idea behind Swift and Certain? Kind of like, I think my mother, God rest her soul, thought of it. Yes, somebody does something bad, you spank them right away, you slap them in the face, and so on, and then you're done. And if you do that quickly and you do that enough, you'll create people who are pro-social, who obey the law. They won't break the law, they won't do terrible things, and so on and so on. When I became a parole officer, my theory was probably from my mother. I didn't know what to do. Nobody ever told me what to do. And I used to go home and tell my mother about what I dealt with that day. She said, you ought to give them a good smash, right? That's her approach to how do we do corrections. It's ridiculous. I love my mother, but it is ridiculous. And so we need to focus much more on what the research is. And then somebody needs to tell us in plain language how to apply it in our job. That's a fault, by the way, of academia that I have always had, and I still have. In academia, we don't convey in a sensible way to the people in politics or the people in policy making decisions what we found, why it's important to do, and why doing it would be in their best interest. That's really important. I learned how to do that by the end of my career. I learned how to talk to very conservative politicians and tell them, look, man, people are going to come out of prison whether you like it or not, 95% of them. How do you want them to come out? And nothing? You want them to come out worse than when they went in? What kind of supervision in the community should they get? And that's what you have to tell politicians. It's about we all want public safety. How do you get there? You don't get there by a quick spanking every time. You get there by doing a variety of things that we've learned from research evidence, starting, I guess, in the early 80s from people like Dr. Gendreau. I don't know if I addressed well enough, Judy, but I'll let somebody else speak if you want.
Yvette?
I concur with what you say, and I'll make a parallel to the mental health system, which is in some ways, I know that in our country, there's been a shift and I guess a movement of the population that was in mental health used to be treated there and now is being treated in corrections because they're lacking services. But there was a movement in the 70s and the 80s to get people out of psychiatric hospital. And in fact, I was part of the process of getting people out of there successfully, I might add. But we were promised to have, for each dollar we took out of the hospital, we were promised this in the community. And then it got down to 50 cents. And then it got down to practically zero.
Oh,
I was
boy.
fortunate in that whatever I asked for, I got, because, and the reason why I got it is this: I was naive, young. I kind of, my first concern was both the clientele we were serving, and I took the job in the middle of a coroner's inquest of a Native person in our country who had committed suicide. And so the staff was quite traumatized by all this, and so was the community. And so the process of taking people out of a psychiatric hospital that had been there for 30 years is not that much different than you take somebody out of a correctional facility that's been there many years, who's been institutionalized. And so what I did is I went and threw tons of training to my staff, training that would get them to think differently about how they were doing their job. And one of the things we brought was, in fact, some new blood. In addition to that, we brought some new staff, and we focused on building community around. So before we took somebody out of an institution, the staff would go in and they would explore with the person who was coming out what they wanted to do, where they wanted to live. And what the staff would do, they would go to the community. Let's say somebody say, well, I'd like to work in a grocery store or whatever, or want to live in that particular space. They would go to the grocery store and they would say to the grocery manager, do you need a volunteer to help you with the grocery? And then there was never any talk about a mental health, because the stigma is just as bad as with correction. And so they connected the two. And then in the process of that, though, they guaranteed the employer that they would support the individual throughout this process as long as it was needed. And I, as a manager, provided the resources to that 24 hours a day. They were on call. The staff rebelled against it initially, but then, we prevented people from going back to the emergency department at Friday afternoon at 3:00, which was a routine. I have been to all the federal prisons in Canada. For 15 years, I was chair of the advisor committee to the Commissioner of Corrections in Canada. And so I saw pretty well every prison, whether it was maximum security, medium, or when they were about to go. And one of the major lack that I've noticed here was a disconnect between those individuals that were preparing their care plans to go out, and the lack of connection and continuity of care once they were out. And I can tell you that in mental health, one of the things that we learned is that if we didn't connect the staff in the community within 72 hours of that person coming out of an institution, they would relapse. They'd be back in the hospital. And so it was critically important. And I think that in the correctional system, it's just as equally important, because they're disconnected from their families. They have nothing around them for the majority of those that are coming out. And when we talk about evidence, one of the things that staff struggle with is size of caseloads, what they do and what they don't do. And I think that we have enough evidence now to know where to focus our energy with the people that we want to make the most difference. And to connect with what Mario was saying, I went around, my staff had a job to do, and so did I. And in my job, I went to the community in which we lived, and I had a big region. I made it my business to go meet the church ministers, I targeted every possible agency that I could to tell them what we were doing, why we were doing it, what we were trying to do, and seeking the support and their help in bringing these people out. And I think in correction, that also should be the case in terms of agencies. There's not enough work being done with, politicians come and go, but agencies can advocate. They can be one of your best ally in helping you get through when you have policies that are counterintuitive to what you want to do, to say the least. And so I would strongly recommend that in the course of your career, try to establish relationship and go get the connections where you can and the support where you can, and build them up over time. And I'll give an example of Mario and Paul. Mario attended a conference they established, and over the years, it's been a support, not just from Paul to Mario, but also Mario to Paul in the context of what do we need in terms of research, where we're going with this, and in a practical sense, which Mario he was in a very practical environment. Not that Paul wasn't, but that added to the element of research impetus, if you want. And so in any field that you're gonna, whether it's whether you're talking about medicine, whether you're talking about sports, just think of playing sports at the highest level and not getting the basic skills, not getting coaching, not getting support through the tough times. So it's a little bit, and athletes, if they're not really focused on the highest level of where they want to go, it can be pretty discouraging along the way. So yes, politics are, in any country you're going to get, it comes and goes. And I think if you have a clear vision on how and where you want to get, and I think to me, that's always, the end product is always the client that you're serving, the individual that you're trying to help, and their families and their communities. And so if you can keep that in mind throughout your career, you're not going to lose yourself, I think. I'll shut up now.
I'd just like to riff off of that, because some of the questions later on are about re-entry. And re-entry to me focuses on information. And you can have good re-entry from prison, obviously, going back into the community. But what you have to try to advocate for is that prisons, however you want it, maximum minimum security, doesn't matter, to probation kinds of settings, you have to make sure that the information flows and that they're in touch with each other, because often these organizations live in isolation. And so where you see some effectiveness is that if a person goes through the prison, gets whatever services they get, all that information is then given to the probation setting to continue this continuity of care. To use a medical model, the person goes into a hospital because of various sorts of ailments and so on and so forth. All kinds of diagnostics and treatment are done, and then that dossier is passed on immediately to the family physician, who then continues that continuity of care, has all of that information. So we do know that sometimes prisons and probation are separate silos, and it's a very difficult job. But wherever you are placed in the correctional system, if you can be a bit of an agent to try to improve the flow of information from one distinct setting to another, then you'll have a better chance of managing your caseload and presumably having some productive results. Another aspect, and this comes from my working in prisons, is that how do you get a step in dealing forward in dealing with management? And so one thing we did at the institution I was based at, and at other institutions in our region, is we came to the superintendents and said, look, do you got any problems do you need some help with? Can we generate some information for you that you may be able to want to use? And we did some simple stuff in regard to, it wasn't necessarily rehabilitation, but it's just generating information that would help the superintendent or the head of the parole service in that agency to make things better. It would also reflect upon them because they had a knowledge base. And so we found that to be a very effective strategy within, and almost in some ways, those I was working in the system, Jim Bont and myself and some others, we were politicians in our own sense, in that we established the links with the administration. It wasn't us versus them. And just, I tell you, there's one superintendent that we said, you've got some real bad apples in this institution. Is there a way we can help you control their behavior? And we instituted what is called a token economy, which was a very effective procedure for changing behavior. And all of a sudden, the program grew, and the superintendent was happy as heck about this because he had fewer complaints in terms of running his institution. And then he could take his evidence and talk to other superintendents in the region and in the province, saying, look what I've done. Okay. And then that's the way you sort of spread the effect in a very, you got to start small. And that way, we were able to survive despite some other things that went on generally politically and stuff, and established our niche. So for those of you young people here who are going out in your business, besides doing the kind of work you can go to your supervisor and say, look, I've read some stuff. This might work. That might work. Can I help you manage your case a little better? And I think most managers would say, well, yeah, give it a shot. I'll pass it over.
Yvette, you're going to say?
You go ahead, Mario. I'll take after.
I'm going to say something that was triggered when Paul said the continuity of information. I know of a system pretty well here in the U.S. in the state of Washington. Now, their system's not perfect overall, don't get me wrong, but they do something interesting along the lines of what Paul was talking about. I've never seen another state do it down here. They have one computer database that the probation officers, call them parole officers as well, enter data into. The prison people use the same database. They use the same risk assessments upon entry to prison that they do when they get out of prison. And interestingly, I always thought it was weird at first, but it makes sense, especially in light of what Paul just said. But a person working in a prison is called a corrections officer. The probation/parole officers in Washington State are called community corrections officers. Now, I'm not particularly nuts about that name, but it's one constant stream of thought. They have a completely different set of criteria to become a probation parole officer than to be a corrections officer. But nevertheless, in the institutions, they use the same risk assessments. They follow the same format for entering notes in a chronological way so that people have the records. And when that person gets released, everything that happened in that case from day one is in the hands of the probation/parole officer, who is called the community corrections officer. And that's the only system I know of that's like that. The rest of them are like what Paul was describing. And I just also wanted to say, unrelated to that, even though it sounds like I'm critical, and I am, I had a great career. I loved it, and I would do it all over again. With all its mess and warts that I had to deal with in someone, it was fantastic. And I met a lot of good people. I helped myself as much as I helped the people I was supervising on parole, I think. And I know I helped some people on parole who had somebody who really cared about doing the work. And I saw the people who were working in cubicles around me who didn't care about doing the work. And I used to think, boy, I would hate to be on probation or parole with that person. It was a great career. I highly recommend it, by the way. And even though it's a mess in many ways, it needs good people. I'll stop there, even and give you a shot.
I'd like to introduce the issue of evaluating programs. So if you're going to go in the field and you're going to administer programs, I would highly recommend to have external sort of a benchmark so that you know how to improve, where to improve, and you do it periodically after you've had an opportunity to implement some changes. I think that that also goes a long way when you talk to people about what you do. You have data, you have information that you can go by, and so it's a continuous improvement. I know that when we go in, Paul and I have done a number of assessment of programs with the correctional program assessment inventory, and what we do is that we compare that to an ideal program. So if you measure somebody who's starting out, there's going to be a lot of missing element, but it helps to design the program in the process of the application of it, and not if you think you have a complete program and it's the wrong approach, then it's more difficult than if you can implement it at the same time as you're implementing the program, so that you can add the elements that might go askew down the road. But the approach that we've had, and when we do a report, is to make suggestion in a manner that an agency or somebody who administers a program will know where to start. And if you can go with number one recommendation, implement one, implement two, in a very systematic way, systematic way, and make sure that you do it right before you proceed to the next recommendation. And don't reevaluate until, everybody has a chance to make it work. Because if you try to make a change in 6 months, it's not going to happen. Give it 2 years, give it time, because there's a lot goes into implementing programs. It's complex. You're changing people's behavior, their attitude, how they do business. And so it takes time. So it takes a lot of patience, but it also needs that vision of where you're going. And having an outside evaluation of what you're trying to do can help bring that along and keep you on the right track. That's just my vision of it.
Thank you, Yvette. Mario, I'd like to go into reentry because they're also studying reentry this week. And one of the questions was, in your experience, what role do community partnerships play in the success of reentry programs? And based on something that Paul and Yvette have both referred to, how can corrections agencies effectively foster those partnerships to support those on community corrections?
Probation and parole, I'm biased, I guess, but probation and parole are the community entity of the criminal justice system. So they need to get out there proactively. No one else is going to do that. And, we're pretty good at this community partnership with police over the last 20 or 30 years. But that's not enough. And it's only one small piece of the business of probation and parole. We need to form partnerships. Yvette touched upon it she mentioned it. She went out to the agencies in the community, including the faith community, et cetera. And by the way, I'll just say what I did in New Jersey. I would go out to those faith people and I would run meetings of people who were on probation and parole in the basements of those churches in Newark or Atlantic City or Patterson, just because they would let me use the church. The church was in the community, closer to where people lived. And I went around the state doing that. By the way, I didn't have to do that. I'm not saying this for a pat on the back, but no other parole board chairman before me or after me ever did that again. So I used to go do something like that. And by the way, people see you're serious. So who did I bring to those meetings? Not just the people on parole. I told them you could bring your families if you want. But I invited people from the unemployment office for the state that, by the way, I referred people to my entire life and they never got one person a job, right? So I would invite them to the meetings, and I would invite the commissioner, because I was a cabinet level person, and I would invite the head of the Department of Labor at the meeting, and I would say, we always want to know what these folks on probation and parole are doing. That's fine, I want to know that, but I also want to know, this month we referred this many people here to the Department of Labor for services in finding a job. What have you done, right? And we talked about that in a positive and in a constructive way. I was proactive with the Department of Rehabilitative Services because they provide services to people with disabilities, including mental health disabilities. You have to be proactive constantly, and you can't wait for somebody else to do it. I did it in conjunction with Rutgers University in Newark. George Kelling, the broken windows guy, he pulled together people from the mayor's office, Congress people, people in Congress, local housing authority. By the way, I've heard people say in corrections, it's not my job to worry about housing issues in communities such where we work, but it is, because lack of housing, lousy housing, houses that are abandoned in our drug dens, that all affects our ability to do what we're supposed to be doing under the banner of corrections. So you can't reenter otherwise. By the way, since reentry came around, every department has a reentry coordinator. I want to throw up. I mean, I bump into them all the time. They talk a good game, but what do they really do, right? What do we really do? They're not doing anything, in my opinion, that's deep enough in terms of going out to the communities and figuring out a way to pull people together on a regular basis from parks and recreation, police, social welfare, mental health, yeah, you name it, and government, obviously. I did that, by the way, not only in New Jersey, but I did it in Staten Island. I did it in Brooklyn. I did it in Baltimore. I did it in Philadelphia with a group of people from the American Probation Parole Association. And by the way, a woman in Staten Island, I'll never forget. And she said, since you've been coming here, things have gotten a lot better. And since we've been coming there, meaning what? Well, we would go there with people from the local grocery store, people from Home Depot was in the area, and we tried to help people get jobs. Literacy centers for people who couldn't read. One of the most shameful things I ran into, people were the most ashamed about their being illiterate. And so they weren't on probation or parole, but if you needed to learn how to read or write and you wanted to, we opened up literacy centers in the community in conjunction with the local schools and the library. All things nobody makes you do, but nobody's going to tell you not to do it either. So my thought was, when I was in charge, I was going to do as much of that as I could, and I did. And it was interesting because you built a lot of great support systems. Another thing I did, I had, those big Winnebago recreational vehicles that hospitals sometimes have. They go around to communities. I had pregnancy testing, sexually transmitted disease once a week in the housing projects, not just for people on parole or people on probation. Can you imagine what the community thought? Somebody really cares. Somebody's really doing something here, right? That they don't have to do. And kids who are afraid to walk across a playground. I remember at an elementary school in the Central Ward of Newark, after school, I got a bunch of probation parole officers together to volunteer. I said, I want you to walk kids home after school, walk them through that playground. Let's go make people feel normal, like we can do this kind of thing. Little things that really show people once and for all, somebody is for real. You can understand, I'm sure, probably many of you have experienced this. We don't feel that the systems that are in place to provide services to us are particularly helpful, right? We need to feel that and believe that in order to respect it. So those are the signs. By the way, that's to me reentry. It's what I always did when I was a parole officer. It's not new. I mean, doesn't it make sense? You have to, if you want people to be successful, you have to focus on how to re-enter them into the community. And I'll just make one more comment and then I'll shut up on this point. But this business about getting fired from jobs because you have a criminal record is hideous, frankly. I just read a case today that I was working on where a guy came out of prison and was just depressed and bummed out. I mean, he got turned down from FedEx. He got turned down from Home Depot. He got turned down from a local automotive shop when they did the background check, and he had a record. He did get hired at one place, but then he got fired because of his record. This is very common, by the way. We can't stop and think all of a sudden the employer is a jerk or a bad guy. They may be, but the real issue is in the U.S. anyway. I've had people with a record working in a place, and on the rare, it doesn't happen all the time, but they committed a crime. Maybe they hit somebody or they robbed a colleague at work, and then that colleague at work sues the employer. And we have a very litigious society down here. Everybody litigates everything. And so employers say, well, if you've got a record, I don't want you here because I don't want to be sued. We've got to figure out a way to create immunity for employers who are big enough to take people on in their employ. We don't do that well enough at all. It breaks my heart when I think about the people I know that had jobs. One guy I know right now, I still stay in touch with him. He's a murderer. Judy knows him. He committed murder. He hasn't committed a murder in 35 years. I stay in touch with him. He went on to become an attorney, by the way, but he never became an attorney because the state of New Jersey won't issue him a license because he committed murder 40 years ago or 35 years ago. When I was the chairman of the parole board, I went and testified to the Supreme Court of the state of New Jersey. I brought the attorney general. Was very proactive. New Jersey is a very liberal state, supposedly. They will not let this guy be licensed to practice law. He's brilliant. He's a beautiful man. I got him a job at a halfway house instead. And then he became a purchasing agent for a large city in New Jersey. And politically, the mayor changed and he's out of a job and he's just about of retirement age now. But we need to be for real. Put your money where your mouth is. I brought him when I spoke in Philadelphia a couple of years ago. He wanted to come. He texted me. He said, "Can I come to Philadelphia and see you speak?" I said, "Sure." I brought him in as my friend, my colleague, and introduced him around. He said, "That's what I've always wanted. I wanted to feel normal." He wanted to feel normal. When does he get redeemed? Right? We're supposed to be in the redemption and forgiveness business. When does he get redeemed? He's always an ex-offender in the eyes of people. So, and look, everybody's not a saint, but a lot of them are. No, I'll leave it at that.
And one thing I'd like to add on to that. How Mario is speaking, he is in part a community organizer. He's using his role as a parole or probation officer in terms of just the bare minimum of the job of supervising and ticking off a box in terms of developing these kinds of things that he did in a true community organizer thing. And you can do that as an individual. And secondly, in the kind of things that he talks about in community corrections, which is reentry, I understand, is that you will get feedback from your successes because people will come up to you and say, "Well, thank you very much," so on and so forth. And so that can be tremendously reinforcing to help you carry on with a difficult job. It's a bit different in institutions whereby your first goal is to make sure everybody is safe, and in that regard, besides providing some services. So that gets me excited when I hear what Mario's done. And he doesn't, in order to do what he did, he doesn't need the official sign off by the governor or someone underneath the governor's assistant. He can do it on his own, and you can, in effect, be a revolutionary at a individual level, still maintain your integrity, and add those reinforcements to the job because it's an extremely difficult one.
Well, we have 4 minutes left. I can either take a question in the chat from someone, or I can ask Paul, Yvette, and Mario one more question. If anyone has a question, just raise your hand. You know how you do that little hand raise thing? But if not, I will ask Paul and Yvette and Mario a question. Paul, you're writing about probation, reentry programs, correct? An article coming out?
Yes.
Not reentry, I'm sorry, probation.
I got 4 minutes left. We've continued our research, particularly Jambata, and he and I are working together on some stuff. It's called the risk-need responsivity model of offender rehabilitation. It's based on cognitive behavior therapy. And we have studies coming out, but that are just cementing the research literature, well-controlled studies. Now, what is the effect size? That is the result. People often expect you in this business to have 100% success rates or 80 or 90% success rates. But our studies show between a 10 to 15% reduction in criminal behavior as a result of these programs. That is by far the best in the business. Again, there's hundreds of studies in that regard. And even if you have a small effects of 5% or 10%, that can be tremendously cost effective. There are studies done in the United States which shows that even turning around the life of one relatively high-risk offender, juvenile, will save hundreds of thousands of bucks. It sounds ridiculous, but it's very important. Look, there's lots of medical literature indicating that a successful medical treatment is one that reduces the problem by 5 or 10%. You know, taking aspirin to prevent strokes. The success rate is about 3%, but overall, it is a real cost saving when that occurs. So don't be misled by people who say, well, that effect isn't very large. In medicine and in our own field, small effects can have tremendous cost savings benefits.
And Paul, what would you say to people who really want to be professionals, credentialed in their field? What is the best thing to do for my students? And Mario and Yvette too, please.
Well, you have to read the literature. You know, that template that I showed on the screen early on was a bit daunting, and I ran over it too quickly. But you have to have a philosophy of who you are and whether you're going to be on the dark side of using qualitative stories that leads to correctional quackery, or you're following a science-based model. Science-based models are not perfect in any area, but it's better than doing nothing. It's better than chance. And once you have that foundation, then you can start looking for literature that is of scientific credibility to support your ideas and what you're doing. And hopefully you can get that coursework at universities, but that's sometimes difficult. So you're going to have to seek it out. And by the way, I'm giving a plug to Jim Bonta, because his recent book in 2024 has all of the evidence that you need to know, particularly in the area of community-based programs. So it's just you just have to have curiosity and find that evidence if you don't get it formally in your training.
Mario? Same question.
Never forget the history and the philosophy of corrections, no matter what's going on every day in your job. Never forget what it's supposed to be, and maybe, hopefully, why you came, why you entered the business. You know, you're going to have people who aren't going to understand what your views are, but by your actions, you'll become a model for at least some other people, and things will change. But never lose sight of who you are. I'm just going to close with an acknowledgement of one person, the most important case that ever crossed my path. And there was a woman named Harriet. I was running one of my famous meetings in Atlantic City at, I forget the church, I'll call it whatever Reverend Washington's church was. It was a big Baptist church. And we had 30 or 40 very high risk probationers and parolees in the room, as we did every month, and community members. And a woman came in the back of the room while we were conducting the meeting. I conducted it with Reverend Washington, by the way. He was my co-leader. And the woman was crying in the back of the room. She's standing in the back of the room crying. And we took a little break. And I walked back there and I introduced myself. I was the chairman of the parole board. By the way, I never met the chairman of the parole board until I became the chairman of the parole board. Nobody, it's like the Wizard of Oz.
He was at our wedding.
It's like the Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. So I went and introduced myself to this woman. She was crying. She said, I just got out a few days ago. She had a handful of prescriptions that the prison didn't give her any supply of medicine on her release. She couldn't get a job in any of the casinos, and those were the only jobs down there because of her record. She was couch surfing at the moment, but had no place to live, and she didn't know what to do. I said, look, I don't know this area much, but I said, is there a pharmacy nearby? And she knew of a local pharmacy. And I went to Reverend Washington. I said, could you take over the meeting? And he did. I said, I'm gonna go take this woman out to the drugstore or whatever. I asked the pharmacist. I went in. I showed him my credentials. I was dressed nice in a suit and everything. And I said, you think you could help me, some kind of arrangement financially? She's got about 15 prescriptions she needs here. And he said, no, there's no social service that can help with that or whatever. Look, I was making a ton of money, for me anyway, at that time. So I said, I'll pay for them. She almost fell on the floor. I almost fell on the floor. I was thinking, what am I doing here? But I had my unmarked Crown Victoria car, and she rode over there with me, and I paid for her prescriptions. By the way, I am confident that woman's life was turned around like forever. She came back the next meeting, made me a carrot cake. I don't like carrot cake, but everybody else enjoyed it. And she wrote me a poem, which I have on my wall. I've always had it. Uh, I won't bore you with it, but it basically is thankful that she met somebody who really was interested in trying to make something happen for her in a real way. And I always remember Harriet, and it's worth it. Just one Harriet makes everything else worth it.
Yvette?
I would like to actually congratulate your students, Judy, because to me, you are the leaders of the future. You are
They are.
the up and coming Paul Gendreau and the Mario and the Yvette and the Judy. It is so critically important. And what I would like to leave you with, and in my career, it has served me very well, is to, wherever you are in your life, pick a mentor somewhere that's outside of your workspace. And it has worked for me in I had 5 cabinet ministers in my backyard. There's a lot of political pressure in hiring people and doing things in a certain way. And I was managing several unions, and I had at arm's length people that I could call in a drop of a hat who were always there for me. You don't need many, you just need one good person or 2 or wherever. But just think of developing those relationships along the way, because, and it's somebody, and I found out much later in my career that this is very much a business model in the business world. You often find this, but it works in our world too. And we absolutely need that to survive at times, not just the politics of the place, but it's a tough job. It's a tough job. You do it to the best of your knowledge. You give a lot, like we've heard Mario, all of us in our career have given 100% and more most of the time. So you need at one point to talk to people who are outside your situation, who can just, listen and just reaffirm that you're doing the right thing, or that you can help, that can help problem solve. And we're not talking about a paid person, we're talking a person of your choosing. So I'm just going to end up with this because it can be helpful along the way in your career.
Well, thank you for that wonderful advice from all 3 of you. And thank you to my students. I'm proud of you. You know, I'm so proud of you all. And thank you for attending our little seminar tonight, our webinar on philosophy of corrections. Thank you, Dr. Gendreau. Thank you, Ms. Theriault and Dr. Paparozzi, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us, and your passion for your career, the career in criminal justice. Thank you so much. And I did make a recording. If anybody wants it, it'll be posted on the Canvas. Okay.
And by the
you.
way, if any students want to email me, I'm still on the UNCP website and the email about advice, career advice, and getting into probation, parole, or that line of work. Please feel free to do so. I have about 45 students who are working in probation and parole in North Carolina right now, and some of them are chiefs, and so on.
And your email address is right on the chat right now. They can grab it right
yeah,
now.
but if you type in Mario, there's no other Mario in the school, and then the rest.
There's no other Mario in North Carolina.
And the same goes for Paul and I. And
may I share your emails with them?
Yep.
May I? Okay, I will do that. I'll put that in Canvas. Okay. Thank you all, and thanks for coming tonight.
And thanks for having us.
Ciao.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm the privileged one. Thank you.
Bye.